A nervous system that withdraws from an unnatural amount of noise is not broken. It is paying attention. It is 7:42 on a Friday evening, a small apartment, a single lamp on. The city outside is loud, but in here it isn't. Somewhere across town, an invitation sits unanswered on a phone screen. Not out of fear, not out of sadness. Just a quiet, total lack of pull. The person on the couch isn't avoiding life. They are doing something psychology has only recently started to take seriously. And the explanation has almost nothing to do with personality. It has to do with a question almost nobody asks. What if the world itself is the unusual one? To understand what's actually happening in that quiet apartment, we need to look at what the human nervous system was actually built for. Somewhere along the way, staying home became a confession. Cancel a plan, and the assumption arrives instantly. Something's wrong. Antisocial, depressed, missing out, falling behind. This judgment is so automatic that almost no one questions where it came from. For most of human history, staying close to a small, familiar space wasn't a problem to be solved. It was simply how people lived. Small communities, predictable rhythms, long stretches of quiet between events. The idea that a full life requires constant outward motion is, historically speaking, an extremely recent invention, one that lines up suspiciously well with industries that profit when people leave the house. This was never really about laziness or fear. This is about a nervous system encountering more stimulation, comparison, and demand for visibility than it was ever designed to process, and responding the only way it knows how. When input outpaces capacity, the body doesn't ask permission. It withdraws to restore balance. That withdrawal gets labeled as a flaw, but the labeling itself deserves scrutiny. Everything seemed like a simple, personal preference, until the actual mechanics of what's happening inside the body started to surface. Here is the first hidden fact. Not everyone who loves staying home is the same kind of person, even though the behavior looks identical from the outside. Psychology actually describes at least 3 separate mechanisms that can produce this exact pattern. And most people, including many who live it, have never had them separated out. The first is energy economics, what's often loosely called introversion. Social interaction, even enjoyable interaction, draws from a limited internal reserve. The cost isn't always felt in the moment. It shows up later as fog, heaviness, a need for silence that isn't sadness, simply depletion. The second is sensory processing sensitivity, a nervous system that registers light, sound, and movement more intensely than average. For this person, a crowded room isn't simply busy, it's a flood. Nothing fades into the background. Everything arrives at full volume. The third, and the one almost never discussed openly, is regulation through withdrawal, a nervous system that has learned, often through accumulated pressure rather than one dramatic event, that pulling back reduces pain. Not avoidance, stabilization, not one explanation, 3 different systems, not a single flaw, a specific architecture. Not the same story for everyone who tells it the same way. Picture 3 different people on the same Friday night in the same kind of apartment, each having declined the same invitation, for 3 entirely different physiological reasons, arriving at the identical outward behavior. But here is where the story takes a darker turn, because all 3 of these legitimate, healthy responses can quietly cross into something else. Ask yourself this: If staying home is genuinely restorative, why does it sometimes stop feeling like relief and start feeling like absence? This is the part almost no source on this topic addresses directly. There is a transition, slow, easy to miss, with no clear before and after moment, where rest quietly becomes retreat. At first, cancelling a plan brings relief. The body softens. The mind clears. Quiet does exactly what it has always done. But over time, something shifts. Going out stops feeling tiring and starts feeling pointless. Invitations feel heavy before they even arrive. The world begins to feel like it's happening somewhere you no longer belong. This is the moment healthy solitude tips into something narrower. Not a crisis, no dramatic break, just a gradual shrinking that's easy to justify as self-care, right up until the day it no longer feels like care at all. Peace was never the destination. It was the rest stop. A nervous system that never moves again has stopped resting. It has started disappearing. And here is the part that complicates the entire cultural conversation around this. The advice almost everyone receives at this stage, get out more, be social, push yourself, frequently makes things worse because it ignores the actual mechanism underneath the behavior. You cannot force a depleted nervous system into overstimulation and call it healing. That isn't balance. That's the same overexposure that caused the withdrawal in the first place, just relabeled as motivation. Stay with me, because what comes next reframes the entire question. Here is the truth underneath all three mechanisms, all the shame and all the cultural judgment. The world was told that loving home means something is wrong with you. The evidence points to something closer to the opposite. In an environment engineered for constant notification, constant comparison, constant visibility, an environment with no real precedent in human history, withdrawing towards stillness may be one of the most intact, accurately calibrated responses a nervous system can produce. The world calls this avoidance. Psychology calls it regulation. The person living it usually just calls it Tuesday. What separates a healthy version of this from a quietly dangerous one isn't the presence of solitude. It's the direction it moves in. Solitude that restores and then releases you back outward is recovery. Solitude that only ever narrows, that stops returning you to the world at all, has crossed into something that needs to be named honestly rather than romanticized. Neither version means something is broken. Both are intelligent responses to real conditions. The difference is simply whether the response is still serving the system or has quietly outlived the threat that created it. A nervous system that withdraws from an unnatural amount of noise is not broken. It is paying attention. This is not a story about people who like staying in on Fridays. It is a story about what happens when an entire culture decides a normal variation in human temperament is a problem requiring correction. Look at where that cultural pressure actually comes from. Every platform competing for attention, every industry built on travel, dining, and constant social participation has a direct financial interest in convincing you that an empty calendar is something to fix. That pressure isn't neutral. It was never just concern for your well-being. If you've spent years quietly feeling behind for preferring quiet, the more useful question isn't, "What's wrong with me?" It's simpler. Is this solitude still moving me back toward life, or has it stopped? Most people will keep treating that distinction as the same thing. Now you know it never was. It is 7:42 on a Friday evening. The lamp is still on. The invitation is still unanswered on the screen. But something has changed in how that quiet reads. Not absence, not avoidance. Calibration, a system working exactly as designed, in a world that rarely asks whether its design even fits anymore.